So everybody, I know some of y'all I've met you in person. Some of you probably don't know me from a hole in the wall. So my name is Bill Dodie, and I am a cybersecurity engineer with Ameren. I've been there just short of 2 years by a couple of months. For those that haven't seen me in a while, I did move positions over the summer. The cybersecurity department created a new department and booted 3 of us into a new position that we're still trying to get our arms around. So essentially my position, we are the guys who are managing projects for Ameren. So anything that is a capital project, the big multi-million-dollar projects, the big initiatives that are coming through the digital/IT department. We are part of those projects. We define the cybersecurity requirements, help them implement, and then any of the cybersecurity products that are getting implemented and future direction, we're also the ones that are responsible for getting that in place. So we're kind of looking at the overall ecosystem and trying to increase cyber adoption and also to improve the tool set. Which is really how we got to my presentation tonight. This is kind of a distillation of some of the things that we've been working on. This is a future concept thing that we've started to work towards. So I thought this would be a good thing to share because it's one of the things that's become painfully obvious to me, particularly in the last couple of years, is that we are really stuck in the past in cybersecurity. And starting with that premise, we started looking for new solutions for some problems that I think pretty much kill everybody. So, which is how we get to the Sassy death of the Moat and Castle. So I want to read this. I'm actually going to read this out loud because we're going to come back to it somewhere in the middle of the presentation. But this is taken from the NIST 800.12 document. The NIST SP's special publications are kind of the Bible of cybersecurity. If you're not familiar with the NIST SP 800s and the cybersecurity framework, go look it up. NIST 837, 12, these are stuff that we refer to all the time in the business. And when I was in school for cybersecurity, I probably quoted them 12 times per paper. It was an easy hit. So providing effective information security requires a comprehensive approach that considers a variety of areas both within and outside of the organization's security field. This approach applies throughout the entire system lifecycle. For example, defense in depth is a security principle used to protect organizational information and systems from threats by implementing multi-layered security countermeasures. Defense in depth utilizes administrative defenses, e.g. policies, procedures, and security technologies, e.g. intrusion detection, systems, firewalls, configuration settings, and antivirus software. In tandem with physical security defenses, e.g. gates and guards, to minimize the probability of successful attack on the system. These measures not only help reduce the likelihood that a security breach will compromise access to system assets or have detrimental effects on confidentiality, integrity, or availability, but also give the organization near real-time notification once an attack has been initiated. Okay, just kind of keep that in mind. I want you to think about what that means, and like I said, we'll come back to it after we go through the first half of the presentation. Why are you not clicking to the next screen? There we go. Okay, I stole this slide from Palo Alto Networks, one of the firewall vendors. So this is the picture of what I would consider a very traditional security setup at a very high level. So you have your data center, you have your branch or your retail, your office buildings. That might be one location, and in some cases it's going to be hundreds or thousands. And then you have your mobile user, and these days we have a lot more mobile users, and a lot of argument can be made for some organizations where we issue everybody a laptop, then that's just kind of the default, that pretty much every user is mobile. And those users are going through these technologies to reach different resources. So a branch of retail, they have a circuit back to your data center. Might be Ethernet, might be fiber, might be a MPLS circuit for a branch office. They are also going through some sort of security device to get to the internet. So they're using firewalls, and they're using web proxies and even unsecured access to just go directly to the internet. For a larger organization, your public cloud, you might have a site-to-site VPN to protect that cloud instance, but one of the things this doesn't represent well is the fact that a lot of cloud stuff is just on the internet, right? And then, of course, your SaaS product, which is becoming way more popular as time goes on. More and more things that we do are appearing in the cloud. They're software as a service, and that's what we're accessing to get everyday work done. And CASB proxy, for those that don't know, this is not something that a lot of organizations have invested heavily in, is a cloud access service broker. And that's kind of a proxy that sits on the cloud side. There's a couple of companies that specialize in this. Netscope is the biggest one, spelled with a K. That acts as a kind of a proxy server to protect your SaaS specific implementations. So if you're using ServiceNow, if you're using Salesforce for your CRM, you can use it for G Suite and for O365 access. It is possible to line those through that, create a proxy, and then do some controls. But you'll notice all of these are fragmented. They're all unrelated, and as much as in the previous slide, it said that you'd have a nice complete view of your entire network and get alerts on everything. These are all individual controls, and in the reality, most of these do not talk to each other. So this is what we have today. And you'll notice that what we end up with is a variety of people in a variety of places doing a variety of things through a variety of different methods. And let's move that on. So let's talk about the moat and castle. I mean firewall. We have built our networks, and even in the cloud, we tend to make this mistake. And I'll explain why I say that's a mistake in the long run, but we have built the moat and castle. The castle is our data center. We put it behind the wall. We put it behind that firewall. We do things. We add some other services. We might do a proxy or a gateway. We might do other stuff. We put in antivirus on our clients, etc. But this has been literally the stalwart of security, and this is what you see in virtually every organization today. Now let's talk about what happens when the firewall. What happens to the firewall? Hold on a second. So first you got your VPN. You want to give people remote access. So you start punching a hole in your firewall and VPN goes. Hang on, I'm trying to get rid of one of the screens here. I think it's going to interfere with my presentation. That's okay. You have SaaS services. One of the things that's becoming increasingly common, there are more and more Fortune 500 companies putting all of their financials up in the cloud with Oracle or SAP. Moving to Oracle in the cloud is a huge thing. Of course, we're all using Office 365 in the corporate environments, or we're using an equivalent G Suite. So there's more of your data and more holes in your firewall, more things you got to do. Then you got Salesforce. If you're doing sales or CRM or even industry-specific applications for SaaS, Salesforce is now a sprawling monster with hundreds and hundreds of apps and hundreds of companies using it to build their applications and do things. So there's more holes in your firewall, more holes in your data center with stuff going in and out. Google Workspace, that's now what they call G Suite apparently. Box, file storage services. What a huge hole that you punch, that if you let people store data outside, well, they can store data outside. Is that your data or is it their data? You don't really know, do you? Bring your own device. How do we manage mobile devices? How do we allow cell phones and tablets and things like that? How do we enable our workers to get to Teams or to Zoom on our corporate accounts and be functional 24 hours a day, because ultimately we would like to not pay them for a lot more work than 8 hours a day. It's a huge challenge. And again, this is punching more and more holes in that firewall. Workday is another one. Most Fortune 500s, again, have looked to Workday. This is now where everybody is sticking their HR data. So you have the crown jewels, your PII, every company being put in the cloud. More holes, more data that you don't control and doesn't sit behind your firewall. Random SaaS, PaaS, IaaS solutions, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft, Azure, that's the one I'm looking for, Azure. There are tons of smaller implementations for various specific purposes, industry-specific stuff. Every one of those requires more you're convoluting your entire platform just to get the data in and out and try to do it safely. And you're adding these holes left and right. I'll throw AWS out there because, you know, everybody wants to watch Netflix from home, right? You all know that's posted in AWS. And then you've got social media. You would be surprised by how many companies allow social media access. For one thing, every company has a PR department and they've got a marketing department, and those people need access to social media. But again, it's more ways that data gets in and out that you have less control over. How do you ensure that your employees are doing the right thing, that they're not getting phished, that there are not other problems, that they're not posting things they should, or that they're not creating liabilities? So, and honestly, this is just a small subsection. I could probably go on all day, and if we opened the floor up, I'm sure you guys could shout at me with hundreds more services that are now resident out in the cloud. This is a full-time job times a million to manage the security platform and to manage what is occurring that goes through that firewall and everything else. There's plenty of other things out there that protect us. But every time we create those holes, every time we disturb that balance in the force, so to speak, we end up with another hole that we have to manage. And when changes happen, when things happen, when you're shifting from vendor to vendor, all of those become more and more problematic. And they also start to lean on each other, where your antivirus or your host firewall conflicts with some other proxy, and you have to figure out what's causing the problem. And what about firewall rules? And if you've been in business for 20 years, your firewall's probably got a bunch of rules in it that you really don't want there or need there anymore. So this entire ecosystem that we have created basically destroys the moat and castle. This is just like moat and castles as a defensive perimeter died in the Middle Ages. I think we've moved past the Middle Ages of information technology, and it's really time to blow up that whole paradigm and start looking for how we can do things different. Let's talk about the various technologies. I call these holes because they really are. Every control that you put in your information security tool chest, anything that you put in, has some way that it needs to get out, or it's talking to things. So these are all controls that we can apply to our technology, to our data, to our servers, to our systems, but they're also holes. They also become ways of getting information in and out, or things that we need to protect. And again, sometimes these end up fighting with each other. We were dealing with an installation of a client on our home machines for a project that we're working on, and it turns out that our home firewalls were blocking a port for the agent that we didn't even know existed, and we didn't even weren't looking for it. So it took 2 days of our lives just to figure out that the firewall at our house was messing around with a new agent in a way that we weren't anticipating. So that's the kind of stuff that happens. Firewalls, again, that's the bulwark. We all have one. We've got one on our box, Windows Defender. You may have one on your cell phone, or worse, you don't. VPNs, the ubiquitous way to get back to your network to allow your remote users to be able to get in and get resources. Data loss prevention. I will say less about this than I should because the next slide I'll make fun of it. DNS is a huge problem. If your DNS is poisoned, or if people make DNS queries, they can exfiltrate data by querying out to a command and control server and sending your data out. So DNS has to be protected. Directory services, somewhat separate from DNS, it really is your Active Directory and LDAP implementations, protecting the very core of identity within your network. We've been doing that for a long time, but username, passwords, man, that is, that's the one. Change your password, use longer passwords. Identity, again, related to directory services, LDAP, but this is one of the most important things. Who you are, what you are, that is how you get access to systems. That's where your authorization and authentication come from. And if you don't have that, you're in a lot of trouble. Agents. I use antivirus, but we have firewall agents on our machines. We have other proxy agents and servers. If you're a corporate level, you're going to have Tanium and McAfee and DLP agents and CASB agents, and the list goes on and on. Proxies. Secure web gateway is probably the most common. Everybody has one, even if that's through your firewall. You're trying to make sure that your internal users can't get to things they shouldn't, gambling, adult sites, things like that. And also that they can't really be tracked or brought back in with bad things. So you've got that proxy sitting out there. And then, of course, to privatize your Moat and Castle, you have network address translation, and you create your private network so that theoretically there's a line between you and the real world, which again, we just punched about 10 billion holes into. So let's talk about what breaks them. All right, so firewalls. What breaks a firewall? Absolutely, the biggest problem with firewalls are complex rules and managing them. Getting a firewall to actually work the way it should, and again, remember, I'm framing this in terms of the modern SaaS, IaaS, PaaS type systems, where everything is out in the cloud. Getting those to work, getting things to properly be secured, and then getting things back into your systems is a level of complexity that, if you're beyond the small office size, can be almost impossible to manage over time. You will eventually screw up with a firewall rule. That is almost a given, that at some point you will write the wrong rule or you will forget to take something out and it will cause you problems. VPNs. Oh, by the way, firewalls were first really thought of and publicized in 1989. So 31 years now that those have been around, and think about that in terms of Moore's Law and how long that exists. VPN. The great boogaloo of VPN is split tunneling. And this is one I do want to focus on because we discovered this really as a significant corporate issue in the time of COVID. For those that don't know what split tunneling is when you have a endpoint that is connected to your VPN, you can make a choice of, does everything go into the VPN tunnel back to corporate and then decide where it needs to go from there? Or do you need to remove certain things from your tunnel because of bandwidth issues? In other words, you're hairpinning a bunch of data back to your data center, into your VPN concentrator and through your network, that maybe it makes no sense to do that. The biggest offender, and you can find this real easily, was Skype. Corporations that use Skype as a legacy service, it's been deprecated. It goes bye-bye in 2 months and we're counting on it. But Skype was a huge bandwidth hog, and when people had their VPNs turned on and they turned on their cameras, Skype lives out in the cloud, people. It does not live in your data center. So all of that data for all of your virtual meetings, for all of your COVID at-home workforce, suddenly went down that VPN pipe and then shut down your network. That also there are similar problems with Teams. It's a little bit better behaved, but it still lives in the O365 cloud. Zoom, all of these have issues. And there are other places where you don't necessarily want to have all of your data coming back and deciding, ooh, then I need to be back in the internet. Doing that hairpinning can slaughter your network, especially if you've got choke points like firewalls. Remember that? Or even slow network links. You know, not every company has a 10 gig or 100 gig fiber optic link to the internet. If you're on a cable modem, if you're on DSL, if you're on a slower speed link, just a few video streams can absolutely slaughter your bandwidth. So bringing those through your VPN, split tunneling is a nightmare. And I can tell you personally, at my workplace at Amarin, we spent the first 2 weeks of COVID trying to figure out how to get Skype out of the tunnel. That was literally IT's highest priority. DLP, data loss prevention. This is a unicorn, a holy grail that we've been trying to do. The origins of DLP actually was out of email systems. Mail transfer agents and secure email gateways were put in place in the early 1990s. I get varying stories from the references, but basically data loss prevention is trying to keep your data from going where it shouldn't, or being able to cut it off if somebody tries to exfiltrate it from your company. It doesn't work. I'll just be blunt. I've never seen a truly workable across the enterprise DLP solution that works. Yes, there are point solutions for certain types of data that work very well. A database access monitoring tool, a DAM, which is basically a firewall for your database, actually works pretty well. But that only protects you with the database. That doesn't protect you from any other type of access. So data that's not stored in a database or gets moved from the database. Somebody does a get and pulls data and puts it in a flat file. Doesn't help you at all. So DLP, that's just one that we all wish we could have it. Everybody does, even if you don't know about it, but it's never really worked at a scale that is passable. DNS. Cloud services can actually really mess with DNS. When you have endpoints that are on a private cloud instance that are not publicly accessible, getting routing to work for an internal call to AWS in your private cloud can be a bit of a problem. And then, as I discussed earlier, DNS poisoning. If somebody can take control of your DNS or feed you bad DNS data, then they can own you. They can direct you to any machine they want on the internet, and your average end user will not know. Directory services. When we talk about LDAP and we talk about Active Directory, again, these are databases. That's all AD or LDAP are. They date back to the earliest directories were X400 databases. They date back actually into the 70s, but modern directories, what we would consider the predecessor to LDAP that came about right about the time that the internet went more public, date back to 1983. And literally they haven't changed that much. Yes, we've added some things on them. You can do some pretty cool stuff with Active Directory inside your environment, but it is still a technology that is old. It has been laying around for a long time, and it can be broken. You can, if someone owns a domain server or your LDAP server or your Kerberos server, all of these having to do with directories and how you authenticate, you're dead in the water. And hybrid environments, again, are the boogaloo. If you're trying to deal with a mainframe, and people still are. If you're trying to get to private cloud environments, you have to go through all kinds of weirdness in order to route your traffic to the right place and not to the wrong place. And then, of course, once you've created all those custom configurations, you're going to end up with the inability to maintain it, and it's going to become harder and harder and harder. Identity. Identity is one that we're getting a lot better on, but there are still a bunch of places where identity can be a really tough thing to crack. If all you've got is a username password list, more power to you. That's awesome. And if you can maintain that safely, even better. But when you're looking at single sign-on, especially out in the cloud, when you're trying to get to cloud services without having your users memorize 50 passwords or even 10 passwords, then SSO becomes increasingly more difficult, particularly because there are multiple standards for single sign-on. Different ways of doing it. Do you do it with OpenID Connect? Do you use, Active Directory, Azure? Do you use Ping Federate? Do you use something, there's all these tools that ADFS that different places do things differently, and a lot of times they'll customize it. So trying to connect to a third party can absolutely rip up your IT environment, and it can break and it can be difficult to set up. Legacy systems, mainframes, man, those things still do 8-character passwords, and that's it. How do you do that and maintain your security? How do you get those systems? And unfortunately, they're still out there. Containers, when you talk about the use of containers in Kubernetes and EKS systems out in the cloud or even internally to your data center, how do you get certificates and the containers to make sure everything is secure? Identity becomes increasingly complex when you have these ephemeral objects that are spawned, do their thing, and go away. And then I've never met an organization other than the actual certificate organizations who can maintain certificates well for internal use. It's one thing if you're going on the internet and you're getting a certificate and setting it up with one of the big certificate companies. That's a fairly simple process. You want to register your web server, more power to you. Everybody can do that. But if you're trying to use certificates in your internal environment in order to secure services, getting one server to talk to another with some authentication and encryption, that becomes another increasingly difficult prospect. And the more systems you have, the more complexity you add, the harder it becomes to do. Again, it's a failure point because it's just difficult to do. There's no easy buttons on certificate management. And certificates date back to 1983. Agents, okay, antivirus, everything else, we talked about it. What do you do about all of your mobile platforms? How do you secure and put antivirus and firewalls and all of that on BYOD? Zero-day exploits. No matter how good your agents are, you just don't know when a zero-day exploit is going to slide right by it. Non-Windows OS. Let's face it, IT, we do Windows really well. Once we get past Windows, things become more difficult. And if you're managing both, it becomes even worse because then you have multiple platforms. I will tell you that my company has struggled very much with Macs. We have to have them for Apple application development, for our marketing department, for other functions that require it, but we have struggled with how to best manage those. Every single time, agents and centralized managing of agents is a huge problem. And then we get to the capacity of the machines. If you have multiple agents, they take memory, they take OS, or they take CPU space, they are impacting your machine. They take out your capacity to do the jobs. And when you get to the point where you're looking at 1, then 2, then 3, then maybe 4, then 5, suddenly the performance of your machine goes through the floor and your end users start complaining. So how do you balance that? Agents date back to the 1990s. Proxies, we talked about this a little bit, secure web gateways, things like that, reverse proxies to manage connections coming in, doing things like API calls through proxies, MuleSoft and products like that. They worked great when we had the Moat and Castle, but how do you manage the cloud with those types of tools? How do you get the right information from point A to point B? Because secure web gateways really just don't adapt at the speed that the cloud does. And then NAT is another one. Again, we all use NAT. If you've got a cable modem, you've got a DSL router, a fiber router at your house, you've got NAT, private hat firewall. It was invented in 1991, but again, hybrid environments. When I am connecting to web or to web services, to AWS, things like that, how do I get my private networks to all talk to each other and to deal with those issues? Again, it's not unovercomable. We're pretty good at this one actually, but it still causes problems. It still causes issues. And then God forbid you go through a merger. So this is why the moat and the castle are not working for us. We've dug our heels in. We've tried to just extend the life of these. In terms of internet time, if you were still using a 286 computer from the early 1990s, from the same generation as DLP and proxies came out of and agents, you'd get nothing done. And we literally have extended the life of all of these services to a degree that is almost staggering. It's amazing that we've got as much use out of them, but we're now seeing the age and the gray hairs, and we need to, as security people, find a different way. And one of the things I really want to point out here, there are no vendors that do all of these things. So when you're looking for that single pane of glass, when you're trying to run down a breach or a potential security violation or something bad happened or compromise of the machine, yes, you can take all this data and you can jam it into Splunk or some of the collection tools, the SIM tools. But at the end of the day, there is no single pane of glass. You're still going to have to bend out. You're going to have to look at other things, and your management and making sure you've got the right information to handle a security breach, to handle any sort of problem, and might be false positive, might not be, don't know till we look, becomes harder and harder and harder. How do you know when you've got this many different services running from at least this many vendors, sometimes more? Some of these will have multiple vendors and almost certainly do. That how do you know that you're getting that information, that you're able to concatenate that, bring it into one place, and that your security operations team is not going to die of a heart attack or old age just trying to respond to a single event, or become so overwhelmed they all quit and leave? So that's the position I think we find ourselves in now. Are we doing okay? I would say yes, just by the very fact that, nothing really bad happens to most of the environments. I mean, it does to some, and those are really bad. We've all had our personal information compromised. Equifax. Did I say that out loud? Sorry. Target. So it doesn't take very many big breaches to cause impact to not only those companies, to their bottom lines, but to us. And we need to be, as security InfoSec professionals, we need to be looking at what the future is. How do we get to the next step? How do we find a better way to do it? And that's where we get to, ARG. This is literally what a lot of InfoSec guys do. They pull their hair out, they're screaming. I've seen it happen on the floor. I've seen guys go into a private room or go outside. I would recommend put the mouse pad down below your head before you start banging it on the table. But this is where every single one of us either has ended up or we will end up, is pulling our hair out and really just frustrated. And we want to make a difference. We don't want to be there. All right, let's come back to the original quote from the NIST 812. So notice the wording here that I've put in orange. Our entire mindset pushes that moat and castle mentality. NIST 800 R12 or 12 R1 is a current document. It is currently being used. It is the most recent version of a document that is extremely valuable. But the very wording of this puts the mentality of moat and castle. We have a system lifecycle, not a security lifecycle, not a development lifecycle, a system lifecycle. That implies in your head, whether you know it or not, that implies that it's a computer system or something like that. It's something you have. We have policies and procedures. Well, those are internal, right? That's what we do. That's how we do it. That's what HR does. Security technologies, intrusion detection systems, firewalls, configuration settings, antivirus. Every single one of those is on your box. That is not a proactive approach that covers the broader scheme of where your data is and where you're going. Gates and guards, again, we're reinforcing that moat and castle. Pull the drawbridge up and we'll be okay, right? Nobody can get in. And system assets. Now, they do at the beginning of this, I will give them credit, they do say that, you know, considers a variety of areas both within and outside. But what I am saying is, as information security professionals, realize the blind spot that you have been operating from and that vendors push on us, that we are literally embracing this moat and castle, old school way of doing things, because we've always done it that way. This is just the way it is. This is what every vendor is coming in and pushing on us, and it's too hard to change. We can't think of anything else. We've made this investment. It's working because there haven't been any breaches yet. But this is where we find ourselves at. And if you really check yourself when you go through the day-to-day of how you do things, what you do, and how you think about things, we're really geared to protect our walls. When you walk into the office building, you're walking past a security guard, or you're walking through a door that gets locked, or you can lock, or somebody unlocks for you in the morning. Those gates and guards, you know, the receptionist, the door to the back. We're still setting up those firewalls and trying to update those and keep up with the rules. We're still trying to find tools like Splunk that we can have the one ring to rule them all. But that all comes back to that same mentality. And that leaves us with a really, really fundamental question of how do we get to the next level? What is the alternative? Because nobody has put forth a good answer to that. We in InfoSec, I would be honestly shocked if any of you who have thought about it this way, or if you've really had any teacher, any mentors, or any companies that have really gone outside the box to think, how can we do the entire system different? How can we move to this future state where none of my assets are going to exist inside of my four walls? Now, I will caveat this. I realize I'm being a little bit dramatic for the sake of effect. Some of you are born in the cloud. I'm pretty sure there may be one person in the room that has a cloud-only company. But I will caution you that even in cloud-only companies or cloud implementations where that's where your data systems are, we still have a tendency to think about them the same way. We still put in firewalls. We go to, you know, the firewall vendors and we buy their virtual firewalls. We put in DLP systems and web application firewalls, WAFs. We still think of it the same way. We still think of, here is our VPC out in the cloud and it's got a border, and we're going to protect that border with the right rules and NAT and private things and keys and encryption. We're doing exactly the same thing. We are literally just rebuilding the wheel made out of stone in a new place. We have not gotten to the point where we find that alternative. That is where I think as an industry, in order to get to something different, in order to reform the very basis of information security, I really think that we need to rethink that. And I didn't invent this, but there are people that are thinking about this, and that's where we're going to move to the next part. So it's time to get sassy. Sassy is a new term. It was actually coined by Gartner. If you know who Gartner is, yes, they're a research company. It's a bunch of geeks that make stuff up and try to push it on you for a lot of money. However, even stop clocks are right twice a day, and Gartner does things well occasionally. And both me and both of my coworkers who have been looking at this, combined, we're probably close to 100 years of experience in IT, and between the three of us, we're easily at a good 40 or 50 in hardcore security, with some very big names, very big companies that you would recognize. We have all come over a period of time and research and talking to an awful lot of vendors and an awful lot of people to believe that this is a valid possibility for the future. And I will explain that when I say possibility. So Sassy stands for Secure Access Service Edge. And what it does is it is taking a bunch of network, and I took this definition from, I can't remember which vendor. I think it was actually Palo Alto as well. No, actually, I'm sorry. This came from Gartner. I do have the reference. I remember now. Sassy is a term that Gartner combined, and it takes a bunch of security functions and networking functions that traditionally we have done inside of our data center on the edge of that moat and castle in our own thing, and we entrust that to the WAN. So we are combining the outside networking and all of our cloud capabilities, all of our access functions at the edge of our network on the other side of the internet drain rather than on our side. We are no longer trying to control everything within our domain. And I will explain these terms, so don't feel that you need to know what all these acronyms mean. I will be honest, when I first saw one of the next slides, that was literally the first time in years that I had to look up an acronym. So don't feel bad if you don't know all of them. You probably do not. And we will talk about it a little bit. I did do some vendor specific stuff at the end of this, but that's not really critical. This is more about capabilities. So what we are looking at is a way of combining a bunch of these security functions in a brand new way that we don't control. Yeah, I know we're all control freaks. We want to log into things and own it. And put that out on the edge so that instead of having a static fixed system where we have a firewall and it is static unless you go in and make a modification, but moment to moment, that thing is basically a set of rules that are locked in stone. Your agents are at the moment locked in stone until they get an update. You know, every capability you have, you've got a configuration. And we're trying to now make that dynamic. And we're also trying to shift the edge from inside of our data center, where if you go back up to the top, how much data is no longer in the data center? Financial, cloud-based services, applications, HR, all of your word processing, no longer there. Storage, yeah, just throw the files to OneDrive, right? So all of that stuff is no longer in your network. So why are your security controls still in your network? And that is what Sassy addressed. So this is kind of a contrast to the earlier one that showed the bit of the Gordian knot of access previously. So this is a conceptual, you guys know I used to be an architect, or some of you do, security architect. So this is more of an architectural diagram. We have our endpoints, the SaaS, your public cloud, your internet, and your headquarters and your data center. Those are all endpoints to where you want your employees, your customers, whoever is accessing your data or needs access to your data, you want them to be able to get to the appropriate data with the appropriate permissions. So what we are doing is that Sassy layer becomes an abstraction layer at the edge of your network, with security as a layer and the networking services as a layer that then push the traffic where it needs to go appropriately. We can apply the controls within that management plane, and we are no longer trying to control it in our HQ or data center or with individual devices at each of these endpoints. So we have literally stuck in this abstraction that allows us to create. It remains to be proven. Again, I'll get to that, but this is possibly the true single pane of glass. If the vendors get to the point where we believe they will, and I'll talk about that as well. This is a brand new type thing and it's being developed as we speak, but this would be a single pane of glass. All of your traffic would get routed through your network edge and then would get pushed to wherever it needs to go with the appropriate controls and the appropriate services attached to it. So we have literally nuked the entire moat and castle idea, and we have ended up with this, which is just a completely conceptually different type of model. This is a little bit better description of Sassy. So now this is kind of a menu. You may not have all of these. You may have some of them, you may pick and choose. They will be dependent on what's appropriate for your organization, for what you're doing. There is the network half, there is the security half. They are both equally important. However, they're built together. So they're not just a bunch of standalone services and things. Start on the network security side. CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker. That's a way of managing your access to SaaS services, to cloud information that's sitting out there. You can see who's accessing it and allow it. That allows you to apply DLP. Remember I said that was a unicorn. CASB is something that actually works. The problem is you have to put your information through the CASB in order to apply DLP. But if you're willing to make that commitment, out on the edge where all the traffic goes through the CASB, if you've got multiple SaaS services, Salesforce and stuff living in AWS and your Oracle in the cloud and your Workday, if you're willing to shove everything through that CASB as your proxy, then you can see all of the traffic. I'm having problems reading that one. Cloud Secure Web Gateway. Again, it's just moving the Secure Web Gateway from your edge out to the brokers so that you can, when your people come in, when they're looking to get to the internet, it'll go through that edge. It won't hairpin back through the VPN. ZTNA, and VPN. This actually nukes the traditional VPN. We put all of these services out at the edge and we route the control. ZTNA is Zero Trust Network Architecture. That is basically a model where every host, every endpoint on your network is not trusted. Is a conditional access network. I could talk about that for several hundred years, probably not necessary. I would recommend really researching it. I can't explain it within the confines of this briefing, but it is a really interesting concept for controlling access where you only trust any service, any host, any person, any identity to the extent that they need to be trusted, only for what they need to be trusted for. The WAAPAAS, I had to look that up. That's Windows that's the new Windows as a, delivering Windows basically as a service. Firewall as a service, putting those virtual firewalls in front of the appropriate hosts. RBI, that was the other one I had to look up, remote browser isolation. So in other words, having a virtual host that executes your browser code rather than doing it on your endpoint protects you from all kinds of bad things that could happen. Java exploits, browser extensions gone amok. DNS, you can put your DNS services out there, trust them to the cloud-based provider and let them provide secured DNS and other connections and manage all of that. SD-WAN, that's kind of getting more towards the zero trust network architecture, SD-WAN, but software defined WAN. In other words, you don't have WAN links between your individual sites. You have WAN that routes over a broader public carrier network automatically and smartly so that you're not just bringing everything down into an aggregation at your headquarters and then throwing it back up. Again, we're eliminating the whole hairpinning of traffic. Carrier services, phones, things like that can be routed through this. WAN optimization, that has to do with SD-WAN. I'm not sure I really care about that, to be honest, because we do our best, but managing your network out at the traffic, managing your network traffic out at the edge allows you to optimize where that traffic goes and how you handle it a lot better. Bandwidth aggregation, again, you're not hairpinning. Your traffic doesn't come down to your data center unless it needs to. Networking vendors. This is actually an abstraction layer that if you have different vendors, Cisco, Palo Alto, there's 100 others out there, Jupiter, blah, 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 keep going. You can abstract and use these services as a way to kind of keep the vendor and their specific stuff out of your network and out of your configurations. Networking as a service, doing on-demand bandwidth increases. If you have ever run a cloud operation or have dealt with cloud service, managing that edge so that you have enough bandwidth, enough processing, all that at the cloud edge is an important part. And that's one of the big draws, that we don't worry about bandwidth when we're out in the cloud. And that's how networking as a service occurs. And then a content delivery network. If you are a provider, if you are Netflix, how do you think they pull it off? Well, they're in AWS and they use some of the CDNs, but that can all be managed by a third party. If you've ever tried to set up a CDN within your network, you'll know how much of a nightmare it can be. I was actually attached to that project at Ameren, and it was abandoned quickly as just way too complicated with almost no bang for the buck. So this is the broader scale of what Sassy brings to the table. This is a really big list. If you're not familiar with cloud and all of that, but this is a lot of things. And let me point out the one thing here that is not immediately obvious. By using the Cloud Access Security Broker and some of the other tools, the Zero Trust Network, you actually eliminate the VPN from the equation entirely. VPNs have issues. I've explained that ad nauseum in this. I'll be glad to go into it in questions, but you eliminate that. You are actually not at all worried about the endpoint, and you're not worried about VPN. If someone has the proper authentication, if they can get through your CASB, if they are getting through the Zero Trust networking, and they can get access, then they will be able to get to the appropriate resources in your data center. No more, no less, but that eliminates the need for that VPN to make the direct connection. If you've ever dealt with a VPN, the idea of getting rid of it is very, very reassuring. We have the option. We use, of course, O365. So if I can, I will stay off the VPN all day. Yes, there are things I can't get to without being in the VPN, but I think all of us would make that choice if we could, to stay out on the edge and not have to type in the password and then the code and then deal with the slowdowns and, oh, you got to relog into everything. You had to reboot, blah. And it timed out, and your network connection and the VPN decided to fight with each other. That happens on my corporate machine, where the network connection just decides to go into wherever. So that's a big win right there, is the entire management of the VPN dies. This is a little thing that we put together. We were comparing vendors for what the Sassy can do versus what what is available from other vendors and the controls. So I'm speaking about Sassy because it does everything. Cloud Access Security Broker, DLP, web content filtering, keep those gambling and adult sites off your network. Secure remote access replaces the VPN. Malware detection can be done on the fly. Firewall as a service, intrusion detection, threat intelligence. All of these things can be applied within the Sassy cloud. Now, when you have a secure web gateway, you get web content filtering and malware detection. Remember, that's a pane of glass. VPN, okay, secure remote access. One thing, one vendor, one product. Data loss prevention, only from data loss prevention vendors. They do not tend to be multilateral, multi-pronged vendors. They do DLP well, or they do DLP as well as they can. They face challenges. Netscope is a CASB vendor, so we put them in there. They are actually they're moving to the Sassy model. They have more things that they can apply, but they're not there yet. And Palo Alto, a next generation firewall, that'll get you some more of these services as well, but again, not everything. We threw Polywall out there because being Amarin, we're keenly interested in red state activity. We deal with that a lot. And so doing some threat intelligence and that sort of thing is actually incredibly critical to our security posture. And so, but again, Polywall is a single vendor product that basically does one or two things really well. So that's just kind of gives you an idea of how many holes there are in other vendors and how much Sassy potentially has to offer. Talking about the vendors, I said I'd do this a little bit, but there are some big players in the Sassy thing. Now, let me explain what I said about how they don't do everything. This is brand new. Gartner came up with the concept about 2 years ago, and these players all jumped into the ring. They all started with a slightly different place in their starting point because that's what their companies did. So Zscaler, that's what they do, is zero trust networking. That is their whole kit bang and caboodle. They have now added other CASB services, but they're offering you a zero trust network for your core network that they can then apply cloud edge services to. Palo Alto is kind of interesting because they started with the next generation firewall. They are the Gartner upper right-hand quadrant for the best firewall for a next generation firewall. But what they did is they actually went to the cloud. And so their Prisma Cloud product is a CASB/SASE service that merges the intelligence and capabilities of the next generation firewall, but applies that to cloud services. You'll notice in the previous chart, there were quite a few X's in their capabilities. And that's why, because they basically went cloud native very early in what they did. Cisco, nobody gets fired for buying Cisco, right? Never have, never will. They did what Cisco always does. They bought a bunch of companies. If you've ever used OpenDNS, if you haven't, I recommend doing so. It's a free DNS that's basically a secure DNS that nobody's looking at you. If you use DNS from AT&T or Charter or anybody else, they see your queries, they can log them, they can track you. So it's one way of getting a little bit away from the man in terms of your privacy. But Cisco basically bought a bunch of vendors, and they're now bundling all of these vendors together in what they call a SASE product. I will leave to your own discovery how well that works. My opinion kind of looks up at a snake belly, but I'm not a big believer in bundling. I'd rather see something built. And then Netscope, talked about that. They are and were and will be the biggest player in the CASB side, and now they've extended that cloud front of, I shouldn't use that term since that's a cloud term, but they've extended that into other parts of the SASE infrastructure. And then I'm amazed by how many people pick up my email address off LinkedIn trying to sell me SASE right now, which I've never actually searched for on LinkedIn. So it's not like they're getting marketing info, but there's a bunch of little players that are saying that they have SASE. Most of them have a couple of capabilities. We'll see how well that works. Now, let's talk a little bit about maturity. As I said, Gartner literally kind of invented this as a concept about 2 years ago. They said, hey, if we could do all these things in one place, that'd be really cool. And they're entirely right. So these vendors are all in a maturity place. When we're doing vendor evaluation, when we're looking at how this could be the future for my company, we approach it from that perspective. Cisco is going to be world-class at routing. They're going to be second best at next generation firewalls. They might have a few things like secure DNS and stuff like that they can offer, but their focus is going to be selling routers and switches. That's what Cisco does best. They do have some pretty good solutions for zero trust and for software-defined networking and software-defined WAN. They're big in that space. Obviously, they're Cisco, they're networking, but they have their limitations because they're always focused on selling boxes. That's ultimately their business model for the moment. Netscope is in some ways a bit player. They're not, but they are. It's probably not a company many of you have ever heard of. They do CASB extraordinarily well. If you're trying to connect your company to ServiceNow, to Salesforce, they do that extraordinarily well. That's where they got their cash from. That's what they built. And it's obvious how they can include other services in that, but that's a slow process for them. And where they have their failure is back in the data center. How are they going to do software-defined networking and software-defined WANs and things like that? That becomes increasingly problematic for them. They may solve it, they may sell out, they may partner. And again, it's always an analysis. This is a journey that is ongoing. Nobody is at the holy grail state yet, although we see glimmers that many of them might get there at some point. And I'd like to back up a couple of slides back to this. One of the things that may not be obvious here in terms of how you do this is the fact that this doesn't all have to be done at once. This is something where you can pick and choose the pieces that you think are most important or where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. I will come back to CASB. As companies migrate more and more services into SaaS solutions, you can set up CASB as like a proxy chain where your secure web gateway goes to the CASB secure web gateway, the CASB gateway feeds the data through, and then the CASB feeds that on to your SaaS solution. That's not necessarily interruptive, and it can even be done without applying policies. In other words, you can collect data and see what people are doing without stopping them. So you can do a ton of data collection to figure out, where are my problems? What are people doing? Are they doing, if you've ever been in IT, if you don't know this, your users will find ways to abuse the system. Undoubtedly, 100%, they will do so. How are they abusing it? If you can't see the data, you don't know. Now you can use CASB to see how that data is going. Did somebody figure out that 9-digit field, you could put a 0 in front and make it a bunch of social security numbers and export it? That's the kind of cleverness that your end user or a bad guy, your APTs, your advanced persistent threats, your hackers, your opportunists, your internal bad actors, that's the kind of stuff that they may think of and you need visibility on. So this is a menu. It is something where you can say, hey, I'm not there yet, but I can pick and choose the pieces, look at how these pieces impact, make that move, and then figure out where it makes sense to apply the next piece. So there is an evolution here. We don't have to just blow up the moat and the castle and the firewall, and one day we switch everything over and life will be hunky-dory, because we all know that doesn't work, right? There's going to be problems, but it gives us a path out, as long as we move to that mentally. Now, and I know we're buttoned up on time, probably a little bit past, so I'll close out. Here's the deal. One of the things that we have issues with in info security, if you don't have issues with it, then you shouldn't be in info security, is trust. How do we trust that an outside vendor or an outside Sassy provider can do as good a job looking at stuff as I can? And that is where I think we need to make the leap. We don't do a good job of it. When we have multiple panes of glass, when we have multiple people, when we have overworked analysts, when we have all of these things happening, we're not doing the best job we possibly can. We have to realize, if the data has already left the data center, if Elvis has left the building, and all of your data or some of your crown jewels, even if it's just some, if you are using ServiceNow, and by the way, you're putting your ticketing information in there with your IP addresses, crown jewels, how do they know what to get to? Oh, look, advanced persistent threat. Now they know where your database servers are. Just saying. That we already put that data out there, we need to move out there to protect it. So once we've made the leap that our data is going to be in the cloud, it really shouldn't be as hard of a leap to relinquish that control and to be able to say, we are going to trust the cloud to secure that data. Remember that every cloud platform has a better visibility to the security layer than your data center ever will. Amazon, as a single vendor, has the best pane of glass possible for Amazon data. They can see everything that happens within your VPC. Same for Salesforce, same for ServiceNow. If we have that abstraction layer where we're looking at how the data goes from our endpoints, whether that's a customer, internal, another server, API calls between different systems, if we have that abstraction layer out in the cloud and we trust it, we are going to have that single pane of glass, and we're going to move to that next step. I will say this, the three people on my team, we are all hardcore pessimists when it comes to technology. If you've heard my previous speeches, you know how down I can be on IT, that we have not delivered, and we really haven't. But this is the possibility of maybe making that anew and really thinking about how we can move past the things we've always done. Get over the not invented here mentality of network security, of information security, and say, how can I do this better? If I get 98% of everything out in the cloud versus 90% in my data center, and I have fewer hassles and I need fewer people and my people can do a better job and respond to things quicker, that's a net win. And that is the promise of Sassy. Whether we get there, I admit there are questions and it's going to take a little bit of time, but it's certainly a paradigm that I think we need to, as information security professionals, pursue. And with that, I will stop doing my favorite thing, which is talking. I'm going to stop the screen sharing so I can see comments. Elizabeth does have the presentation, so you can get a copy of that. There are notes in it too, which kind of followed, kind of didn't bring it up with notes on my screen. So I'll be honest, I kind of winged it. I really love questions, so let's make this interactive. And if anybody has anything or wants to know anything, doesn't necessarily have to be related to the speech. I'm not married to it or anything, but I'm sure there's a lot of information that you have to process and catch up on. So bring it on, guys.
I have a couple thoughts, Bill. Is software-defined perimeter the same thing or different than Sassy?
It's a part of it. So software-defined networking is being able to, it is putting intelligence in your switches. And if we look at software-defined networks, whether they're WANs or internal Ethernet networks, traditionally your network routes at layer 3 and 4, right? That's how you're seeing information in a switch or in a router. You've got your IP address, you've got your host name. That's pretty much what the firewall does. That's what your Ethernet switches see. Layer 2 is included in that for your MAC addresses. Software-defined networking allows you to extend that beyond layer 4 into layer 5, 6, and 7. So your application presentation session. In other words, you can control content that's going and look at the content and control the context. So this is where we get to zero trust networking, is that by having the ability to see all 7 layers of the OSI model, by being able to analyze and control the content that's moving through the network, and by having context, is the identity. Think of identity beyond just username, password. This is something that, again, we get caught up in as InfoSec. Identity is my username and password in the file, right? Identity has to become everything. It is, your servers have an identity. Your services that those servers provide, the web services, the APIs, the applications, the database services, your traditional 3-tier networking, application, web, and database services, those are all identities. And once you apply that to a software-defined network, whether it's a WAN or internal network, That's where that intelligence. So that allows you to control that perimeter, and it doesn't matter what the data is or where it's coming from. We get rid of things like NAT and VPN, or we can conceivably. We may not, I'm not saying we have to, but those things become secondary to being able to protect the information. And that really is where this goes, is moving from protecting boxes, providing services, to actually honestly protecting the information itself and who can see that. We want to give that information to everybody that needs it. That's how our businesses work. I don't care what business you are at some point dependent on making sure people have that information. So that is what it's about, is zero trust networking means I only extend trust to those that absolutely need it and improve their identity, no matter who or what they are. I was listening to a presentation by a guy talking about identity the other night, and he said, imagine a world where literally we can turn off everyone's access the minute that they're supposed to be off shift. And that is a possibility that is real underneath the software-defined banner of networking and wide area networks. So did that answer the question? Did I go the right place?
Yeah, that was good. And then the other question I have is related to compliance. So I've worked on PCI DSS, and I've worked with software as a service compliance, and I guess I can see a lot of this falling under software as a service compliance, and when the service happens to have a payment portion to it being tied to PCI DSS. But I guess I'm just wondering how you would perceive compliance being different in this world versus traditional.
I think that with the addition of an actual DLP solution, one that works as opposed to the hodgepodge that we've kind of tried and done poorly in the past, I think that the auditability and the control of the data is, again, if we're moving towards, maybe not completely there, but if we're moving towards that single pane of glass, then the amount of data that you get from an audit and compliance standpoint, and if you're applying your take a little bit of a step back, this is about making policy. And when I say policy, I'm talking about policies that control the flow of the data. So if we can have a single point to apply policy for all of our data, then we have a single point to extract the compliance and auditability and to prove that and to enforce it. That would be the nirvana. Again, I'm not sure we're actually there yet with the technology, but I'm pretty sure you can imagine how much easier that would make your life in the compliance world if that were true.
Yeah, correct.
that literally is the nirvana for many of us, is just that piece right there. You have to realize that my organization is possibly one of the most heavily regulated, due to the fact that we have customers. We do every type of data. We have PII for our employees. We have PCI that we offload that, to be honest. We leave it entirely in someone else's hands because we'd rather mitigate that risk by getting rid of it. But that doesn't mean that if our vendor gets compromised, we don't get a black eye. Of course, we're energy, right? So we're regulated by DHS and by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and National Energy Regulatory Commission. All of those are different, by the way, and they all have different standards for different things. So that is keenly one of the things that interests us, and our pursuit of this down the road is to say, this compliance piece kind of solves itself if this works as advertised.
Sounds good, thank you.
Anyone else? Or have I bored you all to death? It's a good question, but let me turn that around. If they compromise your firewall, or they find a hole through your O365 controls, or your AWS implementation has a public-facing side that then has an API that calls back into your private AWS VPC that is then connected by direct connect back into your data center, how is that any different? There are always going to be holes. The question is, how much visibility can we have? I agree, it needs to be proven as to how it will work, whether it'll work, blah, blah, blah. There's a ways to go with this technology. Certain pieces of it we know work. We know that next generation firewall piece of this and software defined networks, they actually do work if they're implemented. CASB works, but I would just say, how do you know that your web implementation, your Sassy solution, or your internal network, either one, doesn't have a hole? You're right, there will always be holes. So if I get more visibility, if I have more information in a closer to a single pane of glass, I'm still better off than trusting my old way of doing things, where it's very likely that I have built holes into the system literally to accommodate legacy services and problems. It literally is a mindset. Let me share this, that one CISO that I've talked to about this, that we had a conversation with, his attitude towards this technology was that as a CISO, he wanted to control everything and he did not trust the management plane of the cloud vendors. So AWS, what happens if somebody owns the management plane, if they get in? You all may know, may not know, Azure, Microsoft was completely owned at a level underneath the hypervisor of Azure in the last 12 months. Somebody hacked them, literally, they could see everything in Azure. Could that happen? Yes. Could that happen in my data center? It's probably more likely. There are fewer people watching and more holes. So it is, and his opinion coming out of this is, hey, if I've already moved the crown jewels to the cloud of all of my data, why would I trust the control plane of the cloud less than I would trust the actual services? That makes zero sense. It really does. If you're going to put your data in Oracle in the cloud, in O365, in Workday, in all of these big services, AWS, Google Cloud Platform, all of this, why would you trust the security services less than you trust the actual cloud services? And he said that was his turning point mentally to make that break into saying, this is something worthwhile in pursuing. The financial industry actually does already use this to some degree. As far as I know, I've seen a few banks on the client list of some of my vendors. No reason to believe that they're not, because again, more information is better than less. And we've all seen, banks are a little, I think, they're not as likely to squeeze out the little hacks, but they have to tell the big ones, and we know it's happened. So they're already looking at the next generation. And if you look at processing networks, MasterCard and Visa, those back-end processing networks, a lot of those, especially interbank transfers and things like that, where the big data gets moved, that is already on platforms that are at least partially SD-WAN and things like that, where there is a lot more flexibility in how and when and where and how it's configured. Anyone else? No other comments? Come on, I love the questions at the end. I gotta distract myself from the world somehow. COVID's on my mind.
I just want to say thank you very much.
Not a problem. I am not on the hacking side of things. I build stuff, so I am not the I did that in my teens and 20s. I've moved beyond that in my career. It's much better to be the guy that just tells other people what to do. It's a lot more calming, and I get to go home at 5 every day, unlike many of my coworkers. Well, I'm already home, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else?
All right. Guess that's it. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
It was good to see you guys. Several of you I
too.
haven't seen in a while. If in the presentation, if you get it, my LinkedIn is there and my personal email address. Feel more than free to contact me. I love sharing information. I love teaching. I know a lot of people in this are at the beginning of their careers, but you know, I'm more than willing to share, mentor, or help in any way I can. So feel free to reach out. There are no such thing as stupid questions.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach. It was good to see you, man.
Bill.
Yeah, it's
So
good to see you too.
you.
Yep, good to see you too, Kathy. All right, you
Talk
guys
to you
have a good
later.
evening.
You too. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for putting this on, Elizabeth.
No problem. Hopefully you can make it to the next one.
Yeah, thanks.